Let's dive right into this explainer and explore the fascinating and honestly, sometimes totally terrifying unseen mechanisms of our own minds. Today, we're looking at Carl Jung's groundbreaking work, Psychology and Religion. We usually think of our minds as our own private domain, right? Like a place where we are the absolute ruler. But what if that's a complete illusion? What if there are forces lurking just beneath the surface of our awareness that have the power to completely hijack our reality? Jung's observations turn everything we think we know about sanity, belief, and reality completely upside down. So let's get right into the evidence.
We're starting with a massive medical mystery that Jung actually encountered in his own practice. He describes this highly intelligent man who was utterly destroyed by a carcinoma, a cancer that physically did not exist. His doctors assured him time and time again he was physically fine, no tumor whatsoever. Yet this man was absolutely convinced he was dying from this disease. Now, you might be tempted to just shrug and say, well, it was all in his head. And hey, you would be right, but not in the way you might think. Because to this man, the imaginary cancer was causing very real devastation. It wasn't just some fleeting worry, it was this all-consuming reality that took over his entire existence. The tragic irony here is that this patient was incredibly smart, but his intellect couldn't save him from a fantasy that had completely hijacked his reality. He even admitted, in this weak, defeated voice, that, logically, he knew the cancer was a product of his imagination. But as he put it, the illness was killing his soul. It ruined his relationships, completely destroyed his personal happiness, and just slowly swallowed his entire psychological existence. He was literally transforming from a human being into the malignant, destructive tumor he was imagining. Which brings up a massive question. If he knew it was fake, why couldn't he just stop thinking about it?
To figure that out, here's how we're going to unpack Jung's investigation. We'll look at the power of fantasy, the empirical perspective, the nature of religion, the autonomous unconscious, and finally, the perils of the soul.
All right, Section 1, the power of fantasy and the lethal reality of ideas. So, the absolutely crucial point here is that a fantasy or an idea can be just as real, just as harmful, and just as dangerous as a physical epidemic. We all have this deep-seated materialistic bias that tells us only tangible, physical things are real. We think a biological virus is a real threat, but an obsessive thought is just nothing. Well, Jung completely shatters this idea. He points out that psychological disturbances are arguably way more dangerous than earthquakes or cholera. Think about it. A physical illness harms your body, sure, but an unchecked psychological epidemic, a shared delusion or mass obsession, historically, that has wiped out millions of people through war and ideological fanaticism. The psyche doesn't have a physical weight or shape, but its impact on the real world is absolute. Once an imaginary idea takes hold, it dictates our actions just as forcefully as gravity. Moving to Section 2, the empirical perspective, observing the mind like a science.
In his foundational work, Jung argues vehemently that psychology is a strict empirical science. He is out there observing facts. He famously states that a psychological idea is true simply because it exists, in the exact same way an elephant is true because it exists. An elephant isn't some logical conclusion or an arbitrary invention. It's a phenomenon you can observe. If millions of people across centuries report experiences of spirits, gods, or overwhelming unseen forces, Jung says we can't just brush them off as made up. The experience itself is a psychological fact. He isn't trying to prove whether a literal God exists up in the sky. He is proving that the psychological reality of experiencing a higher power absolutely exists in the human mind, and it behaves according to observable, predictable patterns.
Section 3, the nature of religion, or the psychological definition of faith. Now, to understand why our minds generate these incredibly powerful ideas, we actually have to redefine the word religion itself. In this psychological sense, religion isn't about dogma. It isn't about going to a specific building or reciting a creed. Jung goes way back to the Latin root of the word, religere, which means a cautious and careful consideration. It's a fundamental attitude of the human spirit. It's the act of paying very close, respectful attention to certain dynamic factors in life that are stronger than our conscious will. Whether you call these factors spirits, demons, gods, or psychological complexes, religion is simply the mindset of acknowledging that you are not the supreme ruler of your own life, and that there are forces you really need to carefully observe and respect.
So, what exactly are we observing so carefully? Jung borrows a term from Rudolf Otto, the numinous. The numinous acts upon us completely independently. We are its victims rather than its creators. Think back to that patient with the imaginary cancer.
That obsessive idea was numinous to him. It seized him. It totally dominated him. He didn't wake up one Tuesday and consciously decide to invent a fake disease to ruin his own life. It happened to him. A numinous experience is any psychological event, like a really powerful dream, a sudden undeniable calling, or an overwhelming collective emotion that just sweeps away your conscious intentions. You don't create it, you undergo it.
Let's hit section 4, the autonomous unconscious, the uninvited guests in your mind.
This brilliantly illustrates our next concept. The mind is basically like a house where the conscious ego only thinks it's the sole occupant. The forces that produce these numinous effects are what Jung calls autonomous complexes. Think of them as splintered fragments of our psyche. When Jung ran word association tests, he noticed that sometimes patients wouldn't even respond with their conscious mind. A hidden complex would literally hijack their voice and answer for them. These complexes act exactly like uninvited, super powerful guests. They have their own hidden associations, they bypass our willpower completely, and they invade our conscious mind with totally alien impulses. You think you're the one driving the car of your mind, but an autonomous complex can grab the steering wheel at any given moment, leaving you sitting there wondering, why did I just do that? That is not like me at all.
When the unconscious overwhelms a single individual, you get neurosis and a total loss of control, just like our cancer patient. But when you scale this up to a massive crowd, the rational mind shuts down entirely. The demons slumbering inside each individual suddenly wake up all at once, resulting in mob behavior and mass panic. Jung warns us that a perfectly gentle, rational person can transform into a savage beast when they get swept up by the collective forces of a crowd. Which brings us to our final section, the perils of the soul and how we survive these unseen depths. This scaling up of psychological danger reveals a rather uncomfortable truth about modern society. You see, modern humans arrogantly believe we've totally outgrown superstition. We like to think we're purely rational beings, 100% in control, but by completely denying the existence of the unconscious, we actually drop our defenses, making us highly vulnerable to mass psychosis and ideological possession. The primitive mind, on the other hand, was terrified of what it called the perils of the soul. They understood that a person could lose their mind to a sudden rage or a trance. So they deeply respected these hidden forces. They honored their dreams as divine messages and used really elaborate taboos to safely navigate their psychological landscape. In fact, if we trace this evolution, you can see how those primitive defenses morphed into things we do every single day. Originally, humans used intense rituals to appease the unpredictable forces of nature and the mind. Over time, those became physical taboos, like bowing to expose your neck or showing open hands to prove you weren't holding a weapon. Fast forward to today, and we simply say good morning or shake hands. Jung points out that these modern pleasantries are actually just watered-down magical rituals. We perform them to appease the potentially dangerous, highly unpredictable psychological states of our neighbors. Without even realizing it, we're implicitly saying, hey, please don't let your unconscious demons attack me today. This brings us full circle right back to our brilliant patient with the imaginary cancer. Jung relates his tragic situation to the ancient epic of Gilgamesh. Just as the gods created a wild rival to humble the arrogant hero Gilgamesh, the unconscious will brutally strike down the modern ego if it becomes too full of itself. This man thought he could control the entire world with his intellect alone, so nature sneaked in through the back door and trapped him in an incredibly cruel, irrational obsession just to humble him. It was the ultimate revenge of the unconscious against an ego that abused pure rationality and effectively thought it was a god. I want to leave you with a provocative thought to really challenge your assumptions. We've seen in this explainer that psychological fantasies can be literally as lethal as physical diseases. We've seen empirical evidence of autonomous complexes running around in our heads like uninvited guests. And we've seen that ignoring these forces leaves us incredibly vulnerable to devastating obsessions both individually and as a society. So, the next time a totally uncharacteristic thought pops into your head, or an undeniable impulse suddenly grips you, ask yourself exactly who or what is really running the show inside your own mind. Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning what you think you know.